Right, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Thank you for your continued support. I'm on my own this morning. I have to try and do all the knobs at one time. Nothing in the way else to say, except I hope you enjoy it, and over to Judy.
Thank you, Martin. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Lovely to see you.
Morning.
Hope you're staying well. Lots of nasty things going around that aren't COVID that people have got. So I hope you're staying clear of infections and coughs. And Martin isn't feeling very well. So big thanks to Martin. Big thanks to Martin for setting this up, because he's not feeling 100% by any means. So thank you, Martin.
You're very welcome.
The reign of William II, one of our mysterious kings that little is known about. Maybe you didn't do anything about him at school. I can't remember doing anything about him except his death, which was dramatic. So that's rather an indictment of anybody, isn't it? The most important thing about them is the way they died. But he was, I mean, I had to do quite a bit of research for this because, as I've just said, there aren't any biographies of him on the market as such, and he's one of our least known monarchs. We don't even know exactly when he was born, which is a bad sign. We know it was 1056. Well, we don't know actually 1056, but when you look up his birth date, it's pretty vague. It could be 1056 or 1057 or 1058 even. Third son. That's why we don't know very much about his early life. He was the third son of William, Duke of Normandy, and his wife, the Duchess Matilda. We can imagine him, if he was that sort of person, writing a book, not that he could have done, but writing a book like Prince Harry saying, I'm the spare. I'm the third son, therefore relatively unimportant. Well, he didn't write a book, but it means that we don't know a great deal about his childhood. So I put the heading early life, and then discovered that there's not very much known about his early life. The assumption is that he had the normal upbringing for somebody in his position, nobility, well, royalty, that he would have been trained as a warrior, as a fighting man. He learned to ride very, very early. As soon as they could sit up, they were sort of put on a pony or a small animal, maybe a mule, and they learned to sit on a horse, and then they learned to ride well and hold the reins with one hand and throw a spear with the other, that kind of thing. Some people have said he was illiterate. Other people have argued that no, absolutely not, he could read and write. So a lot of it is speculation. But we do know, which contradicts what I said at the beginning, that he was his father's favourite son. We don't quite, again, it's annoying. We don't know why. Why was he favoured? Why was he the favourite? When William I died, he bequeathed Normandy to his oldest son, who was called Robert Curthose, which meant short trousers. So whether it's a bit like Rishi Sunak, we don't quite know actually why he was called. It was a kind of contemptuous name, Curthose, suggesting that he hadn't very much prowess in the field of battle, because what men preferred, or boys preferred, obviously, was to be praised for their fighting skills rather than short trousers, which is a bit of well, it sounds, it might be quite fun, but you wouldn't want to be stuck with that name forever, and that's what happened to Robert. He was always known as Robert Curthose. And certainly his father didn't seem to have much time for him. He left in Normandy. He gave England to Rufus. In case you're wondering what happened to the second son, he had died as a result, interestingly, of a hunting accident. He was called Richard and he died. So he was the third Rufus was the third son to be born, but there were only two of them left by the time they were adults. So when William the Conqueror died, again, of a kind of riding accident, if you remember, his horse had reared up. There's two stories about this. The horse saw a burning coal coming towards it and reared up, or it trod on a burning brand, it was called. So it trod on some burning wood and the horse reared up, and the iron pommel went into the Conqueror's stomach area and did horrible internal damage. And he died slowly and horribly of what eventually turned into gangrene. So, as we said, plenty of time to repent and plenty of time to change his will if he'd wanted to, but he didn't. He left England to Rufus. So what kind of king was he? Interestingly, some people said he was a very successful king. Other people saying, no, the most interesting thing about his reign was his death. And another opinion, that he was a horrible, horrible man in every way. He was evil, he was cruel, and he was perverted. He was just dreadful. And what we have to remember, I know I keep saying this, but it's so important that certainly, well, it happens even today, we'll come to that. In medieval times, the journalists, people we'd call journalists, particularly investigative journalists and parliamentary reporters, those kind of people, in those days, the chroniclers were all trained for the church. Education was a branch of the church. So the people who were writing the history or writing the official diaries of the time, talking about the king, one political situation, they were all biased in favour of the church. That had been their training, and many of them were celibate members of the church. So if the king, or whoever it was, despised the church in any way, if they laughed at things, or they mocked the clergy, or they made satirical remarks about church services because they thought some aspects of them were ridiculous, and that's apparently what Rufus did, what William II did. He got, we might say today, a misplaced sense of humour. We might today say, you know, he was a barrel of laughs and fun to be with. But he made a mistake of mocking church services, church rituals, and individuals in the church. And as a result, the write-up, his write-up, was very, very hostile. People, the people who were doing the writing and assessing him as a king, dipped their pens in vitriol and wrote about him in an incredibly disparaging way, more than disparaging. So I have to be a little bit suspicious about some of the things they said about him, even during his reign and very much after his reign. Absolutely character assassination. Have to be a little bit cautious. Well, not a little bit, very cautious. The same thing happened to King John. We have to be careful looking at the primary source material and always remembering, looking for bias and the agenda. Why are these people writing this? What is their agenda? What's their background? What's their angle? Just as today, we should be suspicious of certain news items until you know the person's political affiliations. Probably even more so in America, in the United States. What are these people's views? What are their prejudices? And then read what they've written, with bearing that in mind and making a cool judgment as far as that's possible. So one modern historian, interestingly, writes a bit of a rave review, a bit of, so it's writing as though William II had come to him and said, please, will you write me a reference? I'm looking for a job as king. Could you write me a reference, please? glowing. His chivalrous virtues and achievements were all too obvious. He maintained good order and satisfactory justice in England and restored good peace in Normandy. To Normandy. He extended Anglo-Norman rule in Wales, Scotland firmly under his lordship, recovered Maine in France, and exerted his power over another region of France called the Vexin. I'm probably saying that wrong, but I'm saying Vexin, another area of France. That is all very positive. No criticism of him at all. Nothing to sort of create balance. So we're going to start looking at the only way to deal with this, really, when the analysis of his character and of his reign is so contrary and contradictory, is to pick out the good bits, then pick out the bad bits, and then try and get a balanced picture of the man and his reign. So in his favour, the main protagonist was his own brother, Robert, and Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, the guy that is supposed to have commissioned the Bayeux Tapestry. Well, not allegedly, he actually did commission it. He was a troublemaker, Bishop Odo of Bayeux. Under Bishop of Bayeux, Odo, a rebellion took place. The idea being that Robert should take over England as well as Normandy, as his father had been Duke of Normandy and King of England, that Robert should take on the role of King of England instead of brother William. But Robert seems to have had not personality problems exactly, although he never seemed to have very much support. He wasn't very popular, but we don't quite know why. But seemed to have a lazy streak. He didn't come over to England to rally forces. I mean, there was a rebellion in his favour, and he didn't follow up on it. He didn't come over to England and ride around saying, kind of, vote for me, I'm better than my brother. He stayed in Normandy, which was a failure of judgment and a failure of imagination. And probably he ignored advice. You need to go to England now. They don't know you there. And you need to make yourself popular. So King William managed to bribe the English with promises. He promised better government, and he promised a lot of money. In the chroniclers call it silver, meaning vast amounts of money. So in other words, a bribe, a monetary bribe, and the promise of better government. And the rebellion was then sorted out. The English decided that they preferred William. They didn't want a change of leadership, of government. And then William decided he was going to sort his brother out. I don't understand for this, a sort of threat 21 miles away, just across the, well, more than 21 miles, but just across the channel. Brother wanting to be King of England. In 1091, he actually invaded Normandy very successfully. Then made up with his brother, which was false. He couldn't stand his brother by this time, didn't trust him an inch, and eventually imprisoned him. He then, and this gained him many brownie points, William then pursued a really strong defence of his French possessions. So at least people knew that he was powerful and effective and wasn't going to stand any nonsense, very much like his father. He was seen as all these very positive things: effective, brave, quick off the mark, quick acting leader, and that he'd secured his kingdom, and it gave people a sense of security. Probably our ancestors felt, well, we're not crazy about him, but he is a powerful king. He will look after us. We're safe. It give people a feeling of stability. He crushed the opposition effectively, very much like his father. And he then did introduce good central and local government. We'll come back to that when we do the next reign. The big problem that he had was with the church. So after a long delay, which will come into the next category, the long delay was something bad. King William appointed a Norman Italian called Anselm, one of the famous archbishops of Canterbury. He was considered the greatest theologian of his day, and he was ours. He was our archbishop. So, plus points to the king for appointing Anselm. And Anselm introduced a great period of church reform, enormous number of monasteries built, and churches, cathedrals, etc. A vibrant leader. Piety and progress, two lovely words to use for somebody that was introducing reforms, and was Anselm was a dynamic church leader. On the other hand, we don't know what King William's personal beliefs were. Again, very contradictory reports about him, that he was very supportive of Anselm, and exactly the opposite. Well, certainly they clashed. We don't know. I say we don't know whether Rufus was an agnostic or an atheist. I mean, it was very hard to be an atheist in those days. And if you were, you'd keep very quiet about it, because it was a very, very religious age, in a superstitious kind of way, but a very religious age. And we do know that he had, as a strange sense of humour, very much like King John. Thought some of the church rituals are really quite ridiculous. I was foolish enough to say so. On the other hand, he founded this great monastery at Bermondsey and supported it from his own income, his own personal spending money, you could say. And he founded other monasteries and supported the church in terms of money. So the jury's out. We don't really know, which is annoying. There isn't enough evidence one way or the other. What we've got is contradictory. Another plus point, 1091, very busy in 1091. He repelled an invasion by King Malcolm III of Scotland, remembering Scotland was a totally separate country in those days, its own separate kingdom. And Malcolm was forced to pay homage to the King of England. That was seen as a mighty plus point. He actually had to bow down in front of William Rufus and promised to be his vassal. And the king then took control of the northern shires of Cumberland and Westmoreland. You're thinking, well, they're part of England anyway. Why wasn't he the king anyway? Well, because they were so close to Scotland, they were frequently invaded, and the Scots sort of felt that Northumberland and Cumberland actually belonged to Scotland by rights. So it had been a war-torn area for a long time. Never really been settled as belonging to the English king. Well, he settled it, and he built Carlisle Castle just to make sure that everyone behaved themselves. A huge castle with a large garrison of Norman knights to keep an eye on this this area, which was so controversial, a border area, rather like the Marcher lands in Wales, like the border between what is now Wales and England was very fluid in medieval times, and this border was very fluid. And so the King William gained authority over the King of Scotland. He gained authority over these two contested areas in the north, Cumberland, what was Cumberland and Westmoreland. Sorry, I said Northumberland, Cumberland and Westmoreland. And he gained brownie points for having conquered that area and subjugated the King of Scotland. Then he turned his attention to Wales, another controversial area. Nothing actually decided, but again, he built a series of castles, and they disputed border area between Wales and England. And that was seen as a very progressive thing to do. He was trying to maintain, well, wasn't trying, he was actually maintaining law and order in a very lawless part of his kingdom. Throughout medieval times, there were incursions, the Scots in the north and stealing cattle on a regular basis, and the same with Wales. The Welsh would come over a very flexible border and steal cattle. So that was their way of trying to show who was boss. Steal cattle, and then you could sort of ride and try and get your cattle back. And it was a constant. It's a bit like the Wild West in the USA, like an area that had not been subjugated. It wasn't a peaceful area. The border between Wales and England and England and Scotland, very, very restless and a lot going on. And King William did appear to have taken that on board and be dealing with it in a very powerful and effective way. And then the tax system, which had worked well in Saxon times and worked even better under the Normans, particularly following the Great Survey, where William the Conqueror was able to discover how much he was actually owed in taxes from places that were saying, oh, we haven't got any money, we're so poor, we're a poor little town or a poor little village. And then he did this great survey and found out the truth, and therefore he was able to put the taxes up. The tax system was refined in William II's reign, because he was like his father, just as keen on money and knowing that he got the correct amount of money. But then, pretty amazing thing happened. Brother Robert decided to go on the First Crusade. Rather a spontaneous decision, didn't plan it. Typical Robert, didn't really plan it out beforehand. Didn't get what we now call his funding organised, just sort of rather an impulsive, I am going on crusade, now I need lots of money. Where am I going to get this lots of money from? And pledged his duchy in return for a payment of 10,000 marks, vast amount of money. A quarter of William II's annual revenue. And this money was soon raised by levelling a new, heavy, greatly hated tax upon the whole of England. So our ancestors suddenly found that their taxes had gone up. And what's impressive is that they didn't rebel, which is usually what happened in medieval times. If the taxes went up, there was a reaction of some sort. No rebellion. Our ancestors grumbled like anything and complained like mad, but paid up. And William II then ruled as regent of Normandy, so he'd almost kind of got what he wanted, not by stealth, but by his brother being rather irresponsible and trotting off on crusade. It was a very popular thing to do, because the Pope, who had announced the First Crusade, had said, if you go and fight for Christ in Palestine, in the Holy Land, if you are killed, you will go straight to heaven. You won't do any time in purgatory. It's very much like the things that are being told to Islamic fundamentalists and people who fight for Islam. You will go straight to heaven. Well, that was a very, very attractive prospect. You certainly won't go to hell. You'll go to heaven if you're fighting for Christ, or even if you're not killed. You will do far less time in purgatory. If you come home unscathed, you have still been willing to fight for Christ against Christ's enemies, the Muslims. So the First Crusade was actually quite a turning point. It's the First Crusade and the Third Crusade are set as special subjects in very many universities. If you get a history degree, you do the Crusades because they were really important in all sorts of ways, and pretty remarkable when you think of the numbers from different countries that turned up in Palestine to fight against the Muslims who had taken over the holy places. and were banning or barring or making life difficult for Christian pilgrims to visit the shrines. And then both my daughters did. I did the Crusades when I was at university. My daughter was at Durham, to my amazement, did the Crusades. Well, she did the first Crusade in great detail. And then other daughter who was at Kent and changed to a history degree, did the third Crusade in great detail as a special subject. Despite the fact that they keep reviewing and update, not updating, but reviewing the history curriculum, the Crusades are still hang on in there because they're so important. So, Brother Robert, that's why he did this impulsive thing, decided to go on the first crusade, but it ended up with his brother acting as regent, campaigning and gaining new territory from the King of France. So it was a plus point for William, who did not go on crusade, but gained because his brother did. The unsuccessful aspects are trying to get a balance, which historians are supposed to do. Poor family relationships. I think that's already worked out. You've already worked out that there wasn't a very good relationship, certainly between Robert and brother William, and that there was a younger brother called Henry, who later became Henry I. And there's a lovely story. Well, it's not very lovely. If you're having a meal, it's not very lovely. In 1078, William and Henry got bored with casting dice, which something they were amusing themselves with. And the story is that they emptied a full chamber pot over their brother's head. They were on an upper gallery. He was down below. They suddenly had this bright idea of, wouldn't it be fun to empty the full chamber pot on Brother Robert's head? You know, what a laugh, what a lark. Won't that be fun? There was a very spiteful element to it. It might have, we don't know what they were thinking, whether it was done in a malevolent way or whether they were falling about laughing. You know, it was a sort of merry lark, a merry jape. But whichever it was, Brother Robert did not take it in very good part, was absolutely furious and never forgave this humiliation because the servants were there and they saw what happened. I think it was meant deliberately because you couldn't imagine, even if they were brothers who absolutely loved each other and went around together and had fun together, you can't imagine anybody really forgiving having a full chamber pot being emptied onto their head in front of castle servants and saying, oh yeah, what fun. I think it was a humiliation. It was deliberate. He had promised a silver bribe or inducement when he was dealing with the great rebellion against him, the Odo of Bayeux rebellion, and that had swung his English subjects to support him. They swung opinion in his favour. But guess what? He never paid up. It's sort of a promise which was made and believed. You know, believe the word of a king. Surely a king wouldn't say something he didn't mean. Well, that's exactly what he'd done. He'd never had any intention of keeping that promise of lots of silver to be swishing around in the economy, going to the people who had supported him. So I thought, remind you of anyone, the idea that top people break their word in those days was seen as outrageous. If you gave your word, then God was listening. You had given your word to God. It was a pledge. And therefore you should keep your promise. You should be very careful what promises you made. Think about it carefully. And then when you've made the promise, you must keep it. Because it was an honourable thing. It was a pledge of honour. And King Rufus obviously didn't think like that, didn't care that there might be some sort of divine retribution, which is what most of our ancestors would have thought in those days. If I break my word of honour, something awful will happen. Well, that didn't seem to work with William Rufus, which is why it is very likely that he didn't have a strong Christian faith, because people who did have at that time certainly believed in retribution, not just when you died, when God worked out whether you were going to heaven or hell or spending a long time in purgatory, but they believed in immediate retribution, like you'd be struck by lightning or something, or a tree would fall on you, or well, your family would die. There'd be some immediate retribution. That's how our ancestors thought. So they were actually, if they gave promises, they kept them. But King William, no, didn't seem to think like that. Because he'd known when he made the promise he wasn't going to keep it. Again, it does remind you of certain people in the ex-prime ministers who sort of airily knew when they were making the promises that they couldn't keep them, or told lies. Another thing which is very much against William, if we were assessing his personality and assessing how he functioned as king, how effective was he, which is different from whether you like somebody or not. The punishments were very much like the punishments his father had dished out, brutal and primitive. He wanted people to be afraid of him. He didn't want to be loved. He wanted to be feared and respected. And he was feared, and to some extent respected, but not by the people that mattered, that were going to write about him after he died. The clergy certainly didn't respect him, for reasons we've already explained. So an example, 1095, he had problems with his barons, and he won. He was very effective when it came to putting down rebellions, as his father had been. The perpetrators were castrated and blinded, which to us seems so ugly and vile and cruel. And how could people call themselves Christians when they were willing to do something like that? On the other hand, he was respected, certainly feared and respected, which is what he wanted. That's how he wanted to be. His brother Robert, on the other hand, was not neither feared nor respected, and had also all kinds of problems. The other very big issue during his reign was his relationship with the church. Started off very badly. Lanfranc died in 1089, only 2 years after William became king. Another great Archbishop of Canterbury, Lanfranc. And the king then completely ruthlessly, instead of appointing another Archbishop of Canterbury immediately, which is what you'd expect, you know, the vacancy, you appoint somebody else, deliberately left the position open. He didn't appoint anybody, which meant that he could keep the revenues that should have gone to the church, should have gone to Canterbury. He kept them, and they went into the royal treasury, which was totally blatant and shocking, because the revenue for the church belonged to God. In other words, he was stealing from God. He didn't seem very concerned about this at all, which makes one wonder whether he was bothered about his soul. Did he believe he got a soul? Did he believe he was someday going to be judged? It appears not, because this was a shocking thing to do, stealing from God. You could say, if you're looking at it in a political way, well, actually rather cunning, rather clever. Yeah, extra money. How clever was that? But it had repercussions, obviously, as we said at the beginning. The chroniclers were totally horrified by this, because they were members of the church. Ill-gotten gains. Then, I mean, this is interesting. In 1093, he thought he was dying. We don't quite know what was wrong with him, but he got an illness. He was convinced he was dying, and very quickly thought, well, I better make everything all right. I'm going to die, and I'm going to be judged. I mean, I haven't been doing very well in terms of keeping God on side. In fact, I've probably offended God so much that I'm going to end. I'm definitely be going to hell. What can I do? I must do something, because I'm going to die. He very hastily, after all this long time, appointed a new archbishop, Anselm, who, as we've said already, was a great, probably the greatest churchman in Europe at the time. So a great catch, So you can look at it either way. You can say, well, how clever of him to have got this person appointed to be Archbishop of Canterbury, or, well, he did it because he was just afraid that he was dying. And he's alleged to have declared, I mean, this is suggests that he had done it in a panic. Yesterday, I hated him with a great hatred. Today, I hate him with a yet greater hatred. And he can be certain that tomorrow and thereafter, I shall hate him continually with ever fiercer and more bitter hatred. So it's quite childish. It's like a small child stamping its foot, having a tantrum, saying, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you even more. It sounds really ridiculous for a grown man to make this statement of hatred times 4 or times 3. A sort of almost a ridiculous thing to say. And of course went down like a lead balloon with the people who were writing the report on the king. You could say writing his reference. If he really said this, then it doesn't look good for his attitude to the church or to Anselm as in particular. I mean, they clashed. It was a bit like Henry II and Becket. They clashed over various issues. In 1095, the king decided to sort Anselm out. It meant that he didn't have very good judgment when it came to individuals. Anselm wasn't the kind of person you could sort out. He had a very, very strong character. They had a council at Rockingham, called the Council of Rockingham, and the idea was to discipline Anselm, but Anselm refused to cooperate. Even though the king that he was speaking to, he said, as church people often did in that situation, I serve a higher power, who might be the king, but I obey God. Checkmate. And as a result, Anselm went into exile. But it didn't end there. He took his case to the Pope. But Urban II made an agreement with the king, called then and called now a Concordat. In return for William's recognition of Urban II as rightful Pope, because there were issues there, he would agree that Anselm should remain in exile. So this is, in a way, a plus point for the King of England, that he negotiated with the Pope and came out of it really rather well. He didn't have to accept Anselm. The Pope agreed that Anselm could remain in exile. Wasn't able to come back to his home in England. And the king was able to keep the revenues. So back to square one, he was keeping the church revenues. So you could say William II had outwitted the Pope. Well, you could put that in either of the categories. You could say that was an evil thing to do. Just confirms everyone's suspicion that he didn't really care about religion at all and didn't believe he got a soul to save. Or you could say, wow, what a clever thing to do. How cunning and clever, and getting all that money as well. That puts him in the category of good king, teak. This is why it's difficult to sort of put people in categories, because people are complex. And then finally, this suggestion of sodomy and effeminacy. I would say that. Right, I'm not going to say it again. The idea, which is very powerful, because of the chronicler's descriptions of the king and his minions, there's a Latin word you meant minions, followers, but followers in an abject sort of way, that they wore flowing robes, which were not particularly fashionable at the time, that they trailed on the floor, definitely not fashionable at the time. If you look at pictures of Normans, they've got long tunics, sort of reaching just above their knees, or sort of just below their knees, leaving their legs free for action. Long trailing robes, not a very good idea, especially if they're trailing at the back. You know, you're likely like a trip hazard. It means you're not ready for action, quite the reverse. You're ready for sort of sitting down, watching an entertainment. If you're wearing robes that are trailing about on the floor, you are showing off. You're showing off said robes. but you are not expecting to fight or do anything particularly active. And there are quite a few descriptions of the king's courtiers wearing their hair long. Norman hair was short back and sides. Again, so you could wear a helmet. And these men had grown their hair, and so people were sort of flagging up what's wrong with these men. They're obviously not they're not warrior material, very much not. What are they playing at? Wearing perfume, the whole list of things that these young men were doing and that the king was encouraging. Long hair, feminine styles, mincing, walking in a particular way, flagging up the fact that we would say today they were gay. And of course, the church had very strong views about what they called sodomy. Again, the jury's out. Was the king gay? He never married. As far as anybody knows, he didn't have any illegitimate children. On the other hand, trying to be even-handed, there was a legend or a story, can't be authenticated, that an abbess in Scotland had actually advised Princess Edith to take the veil to protect her from the lust of William Rufus. And nobody really questioned that or said, oh, that's just ridiculous, that's just a legend, or that was somebody just made that up. And King Henry I, his brother, actually said that his predecessor made use of concubines, female concubines. So, again, the jury's out. Nobody can really decide. And the people who said that he was, excuse me, effeminate and had a very effeminate court, these minions were very, very obviously gay. We have to remember they were the church, the chroniclers were writing from the church's point of view. Anything they could think of to criticize the king, they would use. They were looking for ammunition to criticize him and say that he was ungodly and shouldn't be king. And we have to remember who was the next king. It was Henry I. When were most of the chroniclers writing? In his reign. So it was what today we now say, bigging Henry I up and denouncing the previous king. So the belief now, well, nobody quite knows. First of all, they think he might have been sterile, and that's why he didn't marry. Impotent, same argument. He didn't want to embarrass himself by marrying and then not producing any children, so he opted not to marry. Bisexual, or had taken a vow of celibacy. That doesn't sound really very convincing. If he scorned many religious ideas at the time, why would he do that? On the other hand, it is a theory. But because there are so many theories and nothing can be proved, it's a mystery. A lot of modern historians choose to ignore this aspect altogether partly because it's controversial, and also because the evidence is so completely contradictory, and anyway they don't want to dwell on it. They're just saying, well, so what, it's irrelevant anyway. So what if he was gay? Doesn't matter. But it is an aspect of his reign which the Victorians were very interested in, and people, I say, modern historians not so interested. They've put that aspect on the back burner because it's controversial, or they really think it's not important. You know, if you're assessing his reign, whatever his sexuality, irrelevant. It is a modern way of looking at it. Or also that you can get into such awful trouble nowadays, sort of treading on eggshells if you write something or even put one word, get one word wrong, you will be sort of denounced by the younger generation. There's something on Radio 4 this morning about somebody being accused of being disliking Islam or being anti-Islamic, and you know, the University of Bristol is now in trouble for not allowing somebody to to continue to be a professor because they've written a book and put something in the book which has offended a lot of young Muslims. So historians today really are treading on eggshells. They're walking on eggshells, trying to keep everybody happy and not offend anybody. So it's really better to leave this aspect of his reign alone, because there are so many hazards now. You've got to be so careful what you write and what you say. And then we move to the death of King William, which is very, very interesting and also very, very controversial. And a bit like a sort of modern murder drama, trying to work out motives and who actually, was he murdered? Was it an accident? What actually happened? Looking at all the information, looking at all the clues, like listening to an episode of Vera or Midsummer Murders, looking for the clues, who benefits, etc. Putting it all together, then trying to draw a conclusion. What actually happened in the New Forest when William Rufus arrived well, healthy and well, and left it as a corpse in August 1100. So we've got a situation where the king, who absolutely loved hunting, like all the Normans, went hunting and never came back alive. What happened? Well, there are various theories, which makes it really interesting. What is known is the 2nd of August, 1100, the king and a group of noblemen with their servants went hunting in the New Forest near Brockenhurst. His younger brother, Prince Henry, was present. That is quite significant. The only definite facts are that the king was killed in the forest, hunting for deer, and that the cause of death was an arrow wound. And the rest is kind of up for grabs, controversial and argued over centuries later. Still, nobody can be absolutely definitely sure what happened. The circumstances are so unusual, I say, they're still being argued over today. Lots of speculation, people with their own theories, people getting angry with other people who don't agree with their theory. I was saying to Martin before we started that I had a friend at uni. I actually helped him with his spelling and his grammar, with his essays, and now he's he retired now, but he became a professor, professor of history. He'd done 2 years national service after he left school, and he hadn't done very well with his A levels. He thought he was going to follow his father and become a sort of carpenter and general handyman like his father. But then, while he was doing his national service, he suddenly realised that he was a lot brighter than he thought he was, and he loved history, and he decided he was going to make a late application to university. And luckily, Birmingham University, in spite of his rather poor A-level results, gave him a place, saw the potential. So this is sorry, lost the thread of what I was going to say, because Martin just beat out.
Sorry.
That's all right. And I say he became I'll come back to that. I'll stick to what I'm supposed to be doing. So the king went hunting with these friends, you could say, noblemen, including somebody called Walter Tyrrell, who normally lived in France but had come over to England. Normally lived with Norman. And what happened was that there's an official story. The official account was that they saw a stag, and the group had divided into two, because they were in a forest, they couldn't all stay together, so they divided into two. So Prince Henry and his group had sort of separated, not deliberately, just because of all the trees and everything. Anyway, they'd seen a stag, And the king apparently had called to Sir Walter Tyrrell, shoot, man, shoot, before the stag moves away or disappears. And according to the official record, the official account, the arrow glanced off a tree, changed direction, and went into the king's heart, went into the king's chest, hit his heart. He fell off his horse and was dead. Another account said he was on foot, but that's a detail. The official account was that it was a total accident, that the arrow had ricocheted off a tree. Yes, Sir Walter Tyrrell had drawn, he was the perpetrator, but it was absolutely not intended to kill the king. Obviously, it was supposed to kill the stag, and instead of that, it killed the king. And he died immediately. Another account says that the arrow went into his back. So already, even with the official account, there's a dispute, which is interesting and suspicious. That it punctured a lung. Not that they would have really known in those days, but it would be bright red blood that came out of it. Maybe they did know that if it punctured a lung, it was just as serious. But was it his front or his back? You say, well, it doesn't matter. Well, it does if somebody's giving an official account. If there's a dispute about it, it does rather suggest that somebody's making this story up, and they haven't kind of collectively decided on the same story. The other part of the story, which is interesting, is that they didn't know what to do. Well, that's understandable. King dead. They'd have been panicking if anybody had been killed. But apparently hunting accidents were very common, with arrows flying around all over. So they commandeered a charcoal burner's cart. And this was significant that it was so undignified that they bundled the king up, probably in his cloak, and lifted him into the cart. And then the official story, this is the official line, that his blood dripped, bright red blood, all the way to Winchester, which is the capital in those days. It had been the capital of Wessex. It was still the royal capital. It was a huge cathedral there, and a castle, and the royal treasury. It was not like London today, or Westminster. It was the capital, and not far away from the New Forest. And that the blood dripped and stayed. It didn't coagulate. So there's something rather odd about that the blood, and why mention it, that the blood dripped out of the cart. The king was still bleeding profusely. It actually suggested he was still alive, but presumably they had checked and he was dead. If he was dead, why was the blood not coagulating? So we will come back to the blood all the way to dripping onto the path all the way to Winchester. Sort of significant. A blood suggesting a blood sacrifice, which we'll come back to. So there are various theories began to be promulgated and have continued ever since, people arguing one way or the other. So the theory one, accident. Arrow hit tree and changed direction. A lot of people have questioned this and said, if an arrow hit a tree, it's not going to have much force left in it. Even if it changes direction, it's more likely to fall onto the ground. And certainly wouldn't have sufficient force to go through somebody's clothing and their chest cavity into their heart and kill somebody instantly. How would it have that much force if it had hit a tree on its way? Not likely. But this was the official explanation, and everybody stuck to it. The second theory, which has a lot going for it, that the king's death was an assassination masterminded by brother Henry, who had been eager for the throne for a long time, very ambitious person. He years later rewarded Tyrrell with a pension. Always very valuable to have a pension. It meant your old age was secured. Another suspicious thing is Henry's reaction when he knew that his brother was lying dead. Whether or not he planned it or whether, whatever happened, he behaved rather suspiciously. He rode off to Winchester in great haste. He didn't stay with the body to make sure that it was treated reverently and honourably. He rushed off to Winchester and took over the royal mint and the royal treasury and declared himself king, which was totally out of order. He should have waited for the King's Council, the Curia Regis or Regis, which later became the House of Lords. He should have waited for them to appoint the new king. It was usually accepted that, that everyone knew who the next in line was. And obviously King Rufus, William Rufus, hadn't had any children, so it was obvious that Henry was the heir. So why the hurry? If he was going to be appointed anyway, why rush off to Winchester and do all these rather, well, not strange things, but as though it was a coup d'etat? A bit like Henry II, getting himself crowned really quickly after Edward the Confessor died. That later gave rise to some people suggesting, well, you obviously didn't think you were the rightful king, so you rushed, you hurried your coronation on so that you got anointed and then you were the official king. Well, King Henry's working in the same way. Why not go through the official channels? Wait, be patient, wait to be appointed king in the right way. What was the hurry? So that's quite suspicious. And there were other indications that Henry had been getting very impatient and very much wanted to be king. And then the third theory is a blood sacrifice, which I said I was going to give more details during the Zoom meeting. This theory only appeared I think it was in the 1950s. So this theory, which was accepted by various historians, was that there was something very special about the date. The 2nd of August was a pagan festival, and that although we're talking about the year 1100, there were still many aspects of pagan belief that had sort of hung on, especially to do with agriculture and harvests, because our ancestors depended completely on the harvest. They grew, the food supply depended on a good harvest. We didn't import food in those days. We grew our own. If the harvest failed, people died of starvation. So our ancestors were obsessed with the weather and with the likelihood of a good or a bad harvest. Well, if it looked like being a bad harvest, and you would know by August, which is why this was an ancient pagan festival of beseeching the gods of harvest to be generous and favourable, and you must offer them something. If it looked as though it was going to be an awful harvest, then you must offer them something. What would you offer? Well, you could try offering food, but that wouldn't be a very sensible idea if you thought you were going to run out of food. And anyway, the pagan gods required blood. So, and this was throughout Europe and in all countries where people, and in other parts of the world, of course, although we didn't know about other parts of the world at that time. But certainly in Europe, although it's Christian by this time, well, apart from the one or two countries that haven't quite made their minds up, but basically by 1100, Europe was Christian. But they quickly reverted. The thought of starvation brought back this fear that they offended the ancient gods by worshipping the Christian God. They had offended the ancient gods, and so they required a blood sacrifice. And you start with animals. If the harvest still looked as though it was going to be awful, you moved on to babies, human babies, and then you could go up through a kind of hierarchy of human importance, ending with a king. The blood of a king would sort it. The greatest sacrifice that could be. And the historians who argue that they argue this theory, they argue it very passionately, they believe that this was the answer, was that the king himself had made some interesting comments that he was near the end of his life. Now, he was strong and healthy at this point, ailed for nothing. And he made some very interesting comments to people, rather cryptic comments about his life nearing its end and putting his affairs in order. Now, he wasn't campaigning, he wasn't across in France fighting. So why did he make these comments? It was, well, according to these historians, he knew because he had agreed to it. He'd agreed to it. He was willing to sacrifice himself. Doesn't actually sound like the William Rufus we've come to know. He doesn't sound like the kind of thing he would do, but then these historians argue that he would have been under huge pressure to sort of save his people by making the supreme sacrifice. And therefore, it had all been set up, and that's why he made these cryptic comments, that he knew his life was limited, and that this terrible thing that happened in the New Forest coincided with this great Celtic festival of worshipping the harvest god and giving them things, giving the harvest god things. The last remains of this belief are corn dollies, because initially what you had to do when you reaped a field, when you took the corn, you had to propitiate the corn goddess by leaving the last sheaf behind. You can make it into a sheaf, but you didn't put it on the harvest cart and take it. You left it behind and you prayed and you said thank you. And the last remains of that in our day and age is corn dollies. You make a corn dolly from the last sheaf of corn, and you then throw it onto the field and you say thank you. And it's fun, but it wasn't fun for our ancestors facing starvation, growing their own food, and they could see that the crop was not developing properly. It was going to be, there'd been storms, or been rain, or there not been enough sun, the weather being so variable in this country and so capricious, that it's hard to imagine how our ancestors spent their lives worrying about the harvest, about the availability of food. And if the weather was, for example, if there'd been a drought, then the grass wouldn't grow, the cattle would be dying, like in Africa. Hard for us to imagine that. But so, was the king a blood sacrifice? Certainly, whole chapters of books have been written on this, and very convincingly too.
And the harvest?
And the harvest, we don't know whether that was. Certainly, there wasn't a famine. No, there wasn't a famine in 1100, but there had been several famines during the previous century. Something we don't even think about. That our ancestors were living on the edge. They were subsistence farmers, and they depended on good weather conditions for a fine harvest, and prayed a lot. And then when things got difficult, they prayed to the old gods, the old goddesses, and begged their forgiveness for having worshipped a Christian God. So, a new king. And Martin's found some lovely pictures of the Rufus stone, which stands in the New Forest, where they think he was killed, where he died. And Martin's found the inscription and published that on page 5 of your notes. Pictures, very difficult to find, because as we know, the artists in those days just were fairly rubbish. I mean, they drew pictures of the king, but they were all the pictures were the same, because they couldn't really draw until the Renaissance. They all looked exactly the same. And then lots of Victorian pictures, and Martin's included one of those. The Victorians loved history as they loved painting scenes from history, and they loved this idea of the king being killed and he's shown on the floor and everybody looking shocked and his horse galloping off. And also the Victorians, like they did a rather lot of paintings with King John. They painted King William because he was an example of a bad king. They didn't mess about. The Victorians had good kings and bad kings, and they used the bad ones as warnings for children. Don't live like this person. Look what happened to him. So they actually did teach, the Victorians taught that it was sort of God's retribution that he died in such an undignified way in the New Forest, and that his body dripped blood. And just to say, the dripping of the blood fits in with the blood sacrifice. Why mention the blood otherwise? That the blood was nourishing the ground so that the harvest would be good. All the way to Winchester, this blood was dripping out of the... Oh, just to say that one of the teachers at Arthur Terry was called Mike Perkis, and he claimed that he was a descendant of the guy that volunteered the cart to take the king's body to Winchester. He was descended from a family that lived in the New Forest, and apparently still do, Perkis, that supplied the cart. So he was a charcoal burner, and apparently there are still charcoal burners in that area. And so Mike Perkins very proudly claimed that he was descended from said charcoal burner, and that was his claim to fame. I'll leave that with you. We don't know whether that's true or not. You can't trace your ancestry back to 1100 unless you're royal or nobleman. So I'll leave that with you. So a lot of unanswered questions, a lot of things to think about. And thank you very much indeed for listening, as usual. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you,
Take
Judy.
care.